My utilitarianism video ended with the question, should you push an innocent fat man onto a train track to be crushed if his body would prevent the train from killing 5 equally innocent people? Utilitarianism seems to require it, but you may have a strong intuition that it's wrong. If so, then you may find some aspects of Immanuel Kant's moral theory compelling. Kant was born in 1724, making him about 20 years older than Jeremy Bentham. He's considered one of the most influential philosophers of all time. His work is often abstract and difficult. What's more, even many Kant fans will often admit that although they agree with his ideas or find his ideas profound, he did not express them very clearly. Kant's moral theory is the most influential in a family of theories today classified as deontological. Deon is the Greek word for duty, the central concept in deontology. And deontologists stand in contrast to utilitarians and other consequentialists because they do not reduce the concept of duty to the production of any sort of results, maintaining instead that what makes actions good or bad is something inherent in the nature of those actions and or the intentions behind them. Kant begins with the concepts of goodwill and duty. As he famously puts it, nothing can possibly be conceived in this world, or even out of it, which can be called good without qualification except a good will. Other things may be good sometimes, or under some circumstances, maybe even every circumstance we are likely to encounter, but not under all possible circumstances. He specifically addresses 2 rival theories, one of which bases morality on happiness and another on positive character traits, or so-called virtues. Against the latter, Kant says that no character trait is always good. Take, for example, courage and intelligence. They're usually good things, but when a mugger is courageous and clever, it just makes them more terrible. As for happiness, the utilitarians and their precursors must admit that, according to their theory, even the happiness of a serial killer torturing a victim is a good thing. It's just outweighed by the suffering of the victim. Kant thinks that that's bizarre, that it's clearly not a good thing, unconditionally. Also, in contrast to some utilitarians, Kant thinks good intentions are morally praiseworthy even if they never lead to anything getting accomplished, or if they're executed poorly with bad results. There's no such thing as moral luck in Kant's view. Naturally, the next question is, what makes a will good? Kant's answer is commonsensical. It needs to be a will to fulfill one's duty, to do the right thing. Now, you might ask how the right thing is determined, but before getting to that, Kant makes a point of clarification. Someone could have a will to do something, and by coincidence, it could happen to be the right thing, without that being their motive for doing it. Ulterior motives are one example. Suppose Theodore is visiting his parents, and while he's there, he moves some furniture for them. But he's doing this because he's planning to ask to borrow some money, and it will make it harder for them to turn him down. This is not a good will according to Kant. Theodore's actions are not specifically moral in nature. He happened to do what his duty demanded, but he didn't do it because duty demanded it. His parents may be happy that the furniture got moved, but according to Kant, Theodore's actions have 0 moral worth. It's no better than if he had done it accidentally, say by bumping into the furniture. Kant calls this acting in mere accordance with duty, in contrast to acting from duty. The distinction is quite sharp for Kant. Suppose when Theodore finds out his parents need furniture moved, he's excited about the opportunity for a workout, or he just loves moving furniture. He's got an obsession with furniture moving techniques or something. He's not thinking about whether it's the right thing to do, he's just happy to do it. In this case, although his motive isn't sneaky or manipulative, it still has nothing to do with morality for Kant. The way Kant puts it, Theodore is merely acting out of his own natural inclination. His decision is only moral if he chooses to move the furniture specifically because it's the right thing to do. He can have both motivations and it's still morally good, but not if he lacks the moral motivation. Kant's own example is a philanthropist who donates large amounts of money to charity, not because they feel obligated, but because they enjoy doing so. However pleasing or positive the results may be, says Kant, there's nothing specifically moral about it. Returning to the question, what constitutes moral duty? Kant begins by examining the concept of an imperative. Grammatically, an imperative is a command to be distinguished from a declarative or exclamation. Kant is really concerned with what's asserted by such commands, the force that they have on our minds, and the motivation they produce in us. He makes a distinction between hypothetical imperatives and categorical ones, the hypothetical being more common and familiar. A hypothetical imperative commands some action in virtue of its efficacy in achieving a desired result. It has binding force on your will if and only if you have the corresponding desire. Hence, hypothetical imperatives are contingent upon your desires. For instance, you may be told you should study patiently. Whether explicitly stated or not, it's assumed that you have certain desires which would be achieved by doing so, such as doing well in your classes. Essentially, the statement could be rephrased to say, you should study patiently, assuming that you want to do well in your classes. If you were independently wealthy, had no material need for education, no stake in your performance, it wouldn't apply to you. You could tell your advisor, I'm really just playing around with school, it doesn't matter if I fail or not, and the appropriate response would be, okay, never mind then, do whatever you want. A categorical imperative is not like that. Without committing to what categorical imperatives specifically say, Kant defines the concept of a categorical imperative as one which is binding on you regardless of your desires. Rather than taking the implicit form, do X if you want to get Y, they simply state, do X. Specific moral injunctions seem to have something like this character, like the rule against random killing. To ask what desire it's contingent upon is to misjudge the nature of the rule. If someone says, you mean don't randomly kill people if I don't want to go to jail, the answer is no, that's not what it means. It means don't do it, full stop. A specific example like this helps illustrate what a categorical imperative needs to look like. But Kant thinks there's only one categorical imperative. It's a general rule from which individual policies like this are derived. Before giving the categorical imperative, Kant narrows this distinction even further. He says that even if an imperative is conditional upon desires that we know every rational being must have, those imperatives are still hypothetical. For example, everyone desires their own happiness. It's part of what it means to be a rational being. So, an imperative that takes the form do X if you want to be happy applies universally. But its application still stems from the corresponding desire for happiness. As an example, Kant brings up norms of prudence. Prudence is kind of an old-fashioned word for managing your affairs well or handling yourself well, taking care of yourself and the like. Everybody has a reason to manage their affairs well, and yet, says Kant, this still isn't the domain of morality, because the application of the imperative is universal, but not categorical. A categorical imperative needs to be so unconditional in its application that it doesn't even depend on whether you want to be happy or not. Kant claims to derive the content of the one categorical imperative from what he's already said about the features such an imperative must have in general. Namely, that it must be not only completely universal, but also unconditional. But he doesn't really explain how this derivation supposedly proceeds. He simply states that it follows and announces the categorical imperative. I'll try to reconstruct the thought process later, but for now let's just state the result. Kant concludes that the categorical imperative tells us, act only on that maxim which you can at the same time will to become a universal law. A maxim is a principle of action. More specifically for Kant, it's the internal thought process that you apply to a situation to decide what to do, which can either be rational or irrational. A universal law is a principle to which all conscious agents adhere at all times. Commentators have labeled this Kant's Universalizability Rule. It asserts a requirement for acting on your maxim, and consequently a test of whether your action would be permissible or impermissible. Let's apply it to some cases. Alexandria wants to borrow some money from a friend, but she knows she won't be able to pay it back. She's considering promising to pay it back anyway because her friend will most likely believe her and give her the money. Can Alexandria act on her maxim while at the same time willing it to become a universal law? We can break this question down into several parts. First, what is Alexandria's maxim? Something like, make a lying promise to get a loan you can't repay. Second, we try to imagine this maxim as a universal law. Imagine a world where everyone always makes lying promises to get loans. The problem is, when we try to fill in this picture, the story kind of breaks down. If everyone made false promises all the time, Kant suggests, the practice of promising just wouldn't exist. There would essentially be no such thing as promising. So the universal version of Alexandria's maxim is ultimately self-contradictory. Everyone makes promises all the time, but there are no promises. I'm not so sure that that follows, but I won't go into it. It's a rabbit hole you can consider exploring yourself. At least I can agree that lenders in this world would regard potential borrowers' statements as irrelevant. This would make the act of promising totally pointless. It could never have any effect. Consequently, willing Alexandria's maxim to become a universal law involves wishing for a situation in which accomplishing the goal of the maxim is impossible. She can't wish that she is accomplishing this deception in a world where accomplishing it is impossible. So the answer to the question, can Alexandria act on her maxim, while at the same time willing that it become a universal law, is no. And the output of the test is that making such a lying promise is not permissible. Consider a second case. Beth has a friend who needs help. He's been evicted from his home and he needs a place to stay, which Beth could provide. However, this would be inconvenient for her. She's considering prioritizing her preference for convenience over her friend's desperate need for help. Again, our first question is, what's the principle she's thinking of following? It seems like it's ignore your friend's problems if it's inconvenient to help. Then we try to imagine a world where this maxim is a universal law, where everyone always ignores any friend in trouble whenever helping is inconvenient. Unlike Alexandria's case, in Beth's case, universalizing the maxim doesn't lead to incoherence. We can, after all, imagine a world in which people never help each other at all, and there's no conflict between, on the one hand, wishing for a world where everyone ignores their friend's problems, and at the same time ignoring your own friend's problems. But there is another problem. It relates to what was said about happiness earlier in a way. Remember that happiness is an example of a desire that every rational agent is guaranteed to have. There are other desires like that too, according to Kant, which we can determine by rational self-interest. One of them is a wish for a sort of assistance principle, that other people be predisposed to help you in times of need. If Beth universalized her maxim, she would be willing that her friends ignore her in times of need. But as a rational being, she also wills that they have a predisposition to help her. So Beth would be willing something that she's also against, which is impossible. Therefore, it's not possible for her to will her maxim to become a universal law, even though the maxim is possible and coherent as a universal law. So the output of the test is that it would be wrong for her to ignore her friend's need for help. A few comments on the workings of the system are in order. Kant's opening discussion emphasized the concept of duty or obligation. It seems incongruous that his test tells us only what not to do rather than what to do. This can be resolved somewhat by taking note of logical relationships between the traditional moral categories. It's worth doing independently anyway. First, permissible and impermissible are direct opposites. If something is permissible, that means it's not wrong to do it. If it's wrong, that means that it's not permissible to do it. And there are other synonyms. Now, what about obligations, duties, things we're required to do? They have to be among the things that are permissible. Something can't be wrong and right. But not all permissible acts are obligatory, only those that it would be wrong not to do. In this way, a statement of obligation can be derived from a statement about what's not okay, specifically what's not okay not to do. Conversely, something that's impermissible can be equated with something that it's obligatory not to do. So perhaps it's enough after all if the test tells us if an action is permissible or impermissible. We can enter a maxim of not doing something, run the test, and if it tells us that that would be wrong, then it is an obligation to do that thing. For instance, in Beth's case, ignoring her friend's need for help was determined to be impermissible. Since not ignoring requires doing something, she has an obligation, a duty to help out somehow. Alexandria's duty is different. The test determined that it would be wrong for her to make a lying promise, but not lying isn't the same as telling the truth. Should she request a loan without mentioning her inability to repay? What if she's asked? We'd have to run the test on each choice separately. I'll leave that to you as an exercise. Returning to the difference between the two cases, Alexandria's obligation not to lie is what Kant calls a perfect duty, whereas Beth's duty to help Kant calls an imperfect duty. The difference corresponds to two different ways a maxim can fail the categorical imperatives test. In Alexandria's case, the universalization of the maxim, or at least the universalization combined with the maxim itself, was inconsistent. In Beth's case, there was no such inconsistency, but there was an inconsistency between the universalization of the maxim and her own self-interest. This difference can actually help to understand the test better. We can divide it into 4 parts. First, formulate the maxim behind the action. Second, universalize the maxim. Third, ask, is the universalization of the maxim inconsistent or inconsistent in combination with the maxim itself? If the answer is yes, as in Alexandria's case, then the action is wrong. Not doing it is a perfect duty. Perfect duties tend to be irreducible negatives, like Alexandria's duty not to lie. On the other hand, if the answer is yes, then we move to step 4. Ask, is the universalization of the maxim inconsistent with self-interest? If the answer is yes, like in Beth's case, then the action is wrong. Not doing it is an imperfect duty. Imperfect duties tend to be negatives that can be reduced to positives, like Beth's duty not to ignore her friend's needs, which translates to a positive duty to help. Imperfect duties also admit of degrees, according to Kant, whereas perfect duties do not. Beth has a duty to help her friend, but exactly how she should help, how much, will depend on her circumstances. By contrast, Alexandria's duty not to lie is all or nothing. Either she lies, which is wrong, or she doesn't lie. And finally, if the answer after reaching step 4 is still no, then the action is permissible. Let's take one more example, something that's obviously permissible, like wearing a blue shirt. Try pausing and running the test on this example yourself. It outputs the answer that we already knew was right. Everyone wearing blue shirts wouldn't create a problem for me wearing one, and everyone wearing blue shirts doesn't conflict with my self-interest, so it's permissible. Note that these examples themselves are not proposed as some astounding new discovery about moral obligation. It's pretty obvious to most people, without bothering about the categorical imperative, that helping friends is the right thing to do, that lying, at least generally, is wrong. We're essentially testing the test to see if the results make sense. Kant is showing that it spits out answers that you basically already knew were right. He would argue that it can provide a deeper understanding of those results, more details, and maybe even some unexpected results. Now that you understand the categorical imperative, let's return to its motivation. How does he arrive at this idea, and what justifies it? To sum up, how is it derived? There's nothing like a clear and direct derivation in Kant's own writing. He makes several suggestions that have intuitive appeal, but there are lots of loose ends, and it's very difficult to patch together a complete picture. In fact, I have my doubts about whether it can even be done, but the attempt to do so should help us understand the theory better. So I'll attempt to fill in the details have some proposals that have long been in circulation. I'll do my best to make sense of them, but I'll also point out where I think they fail. We've already noted that Kant claims the content of the categorical imperative can be derived from the requirement that it be universal and unconditional in its application. It does make sense that a moral law, if it is truly to be a moral law, should be binding on all rational, conscious beings. This amounts to a necessary condition or requirement for anything to be a moral law, on the assumption that a moral law issues commands, obligations. Again, if a moral law gives an obligation, something that everyone is required to do, then a necessary condition for anything to be such a law is that it be possible for everyone to follow it. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. Morality can't possibly demand something that's impossible. For example, if someone thought that I was morally required to fly around the world saving people like Goku, and I'm a bad person for not doing it, then it would be absurd. This is sometimes summed up by the phrase, ought implies can. The idea being, if you're morally required to do something, it has to be something you're at least capable of doing. And since morality needs to be binding on everyone, moral obligations can't negate one another. Morality surely doesn't require that you work harder than all other people, for example, because if that were the case, at most one person could do the right thing. It would be impossible for everyone to obey. So the ought implies can principle places a necessary condition on anything being a moral law. And if we understand necessary conditions, which is a point from logic that you can watch a video of mine on, you'll understand that we can rephrase this principle in the following way. If rule X is a moral law, then it is possible for everyone to follow it. We can also rephrase 1 in another way. By a principle of logic called transposition or contraposition, 1 is logically equivalent to 2. If it's impossible for everyone to follow rule X, then it can't be a moral law. Perhaps this could be at least a piece of Kant's reasoning. 1 seems clearly true, and 2 follows from 1 logically. 2 does look something like the categorical imperative. However, upon further inspection, it isn't quite the same as the categorical imperative. If we were to state the categorical imperative in similar terms, it would go something like this. I'll simplify by leaving out the point about conflicting with self-interest. 3. If it's impossible for everyone to follow maxim X, then it can't be moral to follow it. 3 might look like it's saying the same thing as 2 at first. And it is a train of thought that leads from something Kant directly said to something very much like the categorical imperative. I'm not prepared to argue textually that this is Kant's reasoning. The point here is just to provide some way of connecting the dots in an effort to make sense of the whole thing. But if that was Kant's reasoning, it contains a major error. The change from a discussion of moral laws to that of maxims that are moral to follow is more significant than is perhaps at first noticeable. A maxim, an impulse or plan or whatever that is moral to follow is something permissible. But a moral law in the relevant sense tells us something is obligatory. What 2 says is true. Being universalizable is a requirement for it to be obligatory to follow some plan or maxim. But that doesn't prove 3, which says that being universalizable is a requirement for it to be permissible to follow some plan or maxim. So that's a potential train of thought that might lead to the categorical imperative, but we see that there's an error. Now, what argument could conclude that morality never permits X, where X is some action that can't be universalized? Maybe the idea is that if a moral system allows everyone to do X, then that moral system is courting some problematic situation. Because if everyone simultaneously decided to do it collectively, they'd be attempting to bring about an impossible result. It is true that if that happened, people's individual efforts would fail to be coordinated as if produced by a single rational mind. But why is it important that people's activities be coordinated as if produced by a single rational mind? Furthermore, it seems like we can think of obviously permissible actions that can't be universalized because they would involve such failure of coordination. If so, these would constitute counterexamples to the theory. Take something as simple as collecting an insurance payment. If a tree falls on my house, I can collect insurance to pay for the repairs, which obviously seems morally permissible. But if everyone simultaneously tried to collect, say because a lot of trees fell at once, then the insurance company declares bankruptcy and none of us gets our payment. So the maxim of collecting an insurance payment seems impossible to universalize. But it's absurd to think it's immoral to collect insurance. Counterexamples like this one suggest a general defect. Kant's theory seems to be against uniqueness in a strange way. Lots of things are fine for one person to do, but problematic if everyone does them. Another element that commentators tie into the motivation for the categorical imperative is Kant's concern with rationality. It's clear that he associates immorality with some kind of irrationality or confusion. Picture again Alexandria, unwittingly wishing for a situation that's impossible, promoting A while also promoting not A, or at least endorsing a situation in which she can't possibly do what she tries to do. For Kant, the heart of immorality is making exceptions for yourself. The idea is that there's a form of irrationality involved in that. It makes some intuitive sense. You get to break the rule you expect everyone else to follow, but there's nothing special about you or your circumstances that explain why you should. More extreme examples seem to illustrate the point even more. Think of the mafioso who steals at will, but he's not okay with other people stealing from him, of course. He still wants it to be a rule that nobody steals. It's another question how this irrationality to immorality connection allegedly arises out of or connects up with the categorical imperative. A person acts on a maxim that can't be universalized, and this supposedly makes them irrational in some way. But why? If they just don't wish for it to be universalized, then they're not wishing for anything contradictory. Of course, Kant wants to say you need to be able to wish for it to be universalized. That's his rule, but again, why? One idea that could connect the dots here would be what I'll call the endorsement theory. It's the idea that whenever you do anything, you are tacitly endorsing that type of thing. You're saying, everyone should behave like this. You're presenting yourself as an example for all of humankind, indeed all rational, intelligent beings to follow. If endorsement theory were true, then we could convict Alexandria and Beth and the mafioso of irrationality in the way that Kant wants to. However, it doesn't seem like endorsement theory is true. I do all kinds of things without wanting to promote them for everyone. And in particular, if you're doing something that it wouldn't be possible for everyone to do, then the idea that you're somehow subconsciously promoting that everyone do it is even less plausible. So if Kant is assuming this endorsement idea, there's some serious problems to sort out. Of course, the categorical imperative doesn't say that you're always endorsing the universalization of your maxim. It's that you ought to be able to. But I'm asking about the derivation of that principle, which can't proceed by assuming the principle itself. Otherwise, it would be a vicious circle. We're still left wondering how defiance of the categorical imperative is somehow tantamount to irrationality because of a hypothetical endorsement, not an actual one. Because of how inconsistent, how confused someone's mindset would be if they endorsed a universalized version of the maxim of their action, which, for all we know, they don't. Let's set aside universalizability for now. Kant offers what he calls a second formulation of the categorical imperative, which some philosophers have found less problematic. Here's a version of it. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, in yourself or in others, always as an end in itself and never only as a means to an end. This is known as the formula of humanity. Remember, Kant says there's only one categorical imperative, so this is not another one. It's supposed to be the same principle as the Universalizability Rule, just reformulated or equivalent in some sense, which is immediately puzzling because they don't look equivalent at all. Kant's reasoning on their equivalence, like his derivation of the universalizability formula, is another element of his philosophy that's difficult to reconstruct. I'll set it aside for now. Like the universalizability formula, the humanity formula also sets up a requirement for an action to be morally permissible with a corresponding test. And again, there are two ways to fail this test, just like the first one. The humanity formula explicitly states two requirements. A, that you never treat humanity only as a means to an end, and B, that you always treat humanity as an end in itself. First, let's review the terminology. In old-fashioned English, the word end can mean something like the word goal, something you want to get or achieve. Then a means to an end refers to how you get it. Treating someone's humanity as a means to an end roughly means using them, as if their human capacities were a tool for you to get what you want. The opposite, treating someone's humanity as an end in itself, is more abstract. The general idea is that you respect the essential features humans have as rational beings, including their personal goals, the development of their human capacities, and the whole system of life which they have set up in their minds. In this case, respecting these things means more than simply not interfering. To some extent, you must treat their goals as your own goals too. This connects in some sense with Kant's claim that a rational being such as a human has an inherent worthiness, and there's a corresponding worthiness to their thoughts and choices about what to pursue with their life. There are lots of loose ends in this characterization of an end in itself, but again, they're not easily tied together to form a complete and coherent picture. Hopefully what's been said is enough to make sense of the workings of the formula. Notice that Clause A does not strictly prohibit treating someone as a means to an end. It says never to treat a person, or more accurately their humanity, only as a means to an end, which does allow treating them as a means as long as you're also treating them as an end. Here's a simple example. You pull into a shopping plaza and there's a hot dog vendor in the parking lot. His name is Carl. You're hungry and you decide you want a hot dog. By buying a hot dog from Carl, you are using his humanity as a means to an end. The efforts he's made, the activities he has undertaken, purchasing the hot dog cart, bringing it to the plaza, cooking the hot dogs, and so on, stem from his essential qualities as a human being, especially his capacity for rational decision-making and the formation of goals. You have now repurposed those decisions and activities so that they realize your own goal, getting a hot dog into your hand. In short, you are using Carl. However, you're also treating his humanity as an end in itself because he would consent to the way and the conditions under which you repurpose it. In fact, he has explicitly consented by selling you the hot dog, and he in turn uses your humanity as a means to his end, to make a profit, under conditions to which you've consented. Neither of you violates the humanity formula. But suppose Carl steps away from his cart for a minute, and you take the opportunity to grab 3 or 4 hot dogs without paying. Then you will have used his humanity purely as a means to an end, without also treating it as an end in itself. All the decisions and preparations that he underwent to create this situation have been repurposed by you under conditions to which he would not consent because they're not in harmony with his goals. You've cast aside the reasons he's chosen to spend his time in this way, as if he was just some ridiculous machine that randomly brings hot dogs to a parking lot for no good reason. Conversely, the same would be true if Carl tricked you into paying him. Say you're Muslim and you ask if the hot dogs are halal. Oh yeah, says Carl. Halal beef, no pork. When really they're just pure pork. The reasons you have for avoiding pork are totally irrelevant to Carl. He's acting like your decisions about what a person needs to do in life don't matter. He's willing to repurpose your entire thought process and turn it into something that brings him what he wants, with no concern for the goals and purposes that emerge from within your thought process. Now consider the case of Alexandria from earlier and apply the second formulation to it. Pause the video if you want. According to Kant, you should get the same result we derived from the first formula. Alexandria uses her friend's money-lending capacity without concern for her friend's self-determination. Now, Kant maintains that the two formulas produce the same results, not just for Alexandria's case, but for all possible cases. A case where the formulas produce different results would therefore constitute an objection to the coherence of Kant's system as a whole, although it wouldn't prove that each formula was individually wrong. The counterexample I gave earlier as an objection to the universalizability formula is one potential candidate for such a case. I argued that collecting insurance is not universalizable because if everyone collected, there wouldn't be enough money. But it doesn't seem to violate the humanity formula. Collecting insurance doesn't use the owners of the insurance company in a way to which they wouldn't consent. They have explicitly consented to the terms of the insurance agreement. Returning to the workings of the formula, if you use someone as only a means, violating Clause A, then you automatically violate Clause B too. But it is possible to violate Clause B without violating Clause A. According to Clause B, just refraining from treating humanity only as a means to an end is not enough. There's also a positive requirement that we do treat everyone's humanity as an end in itself. Return to Beth's case. She wanted to ignore her friend who needs help. This doesn't violate the A clause of the humanity formula. She's not treating her friend's humanity as a mere means or using him in any way. She's ignoring him, not interacting with him at all. But the B clause requires that she treat his humanity as an end in itself. That requires, in short, assigning him an inherent value and embracing his goals as if they were to some extent her own. Ignoring a friend in need, therefore, violates the humanity formula too, making it impermissible, which is in agreement with the first formula. The distinction between perfect and imperfect duties also arises from the humanity formula in allegedly the same way and in the same cases as from the first formula. We first ask if an action would treat someone's humanity purely as a means to an end, without also treating it as an end in itself. If the answer is yes, like stealing hot dogs, then the action is impermissible. Not doing it is a perfect duty. On the other hand, if the answer is no, we move to the next step and ask if it does treat the person's humanity as an end in itself. This time, if the answer is no, like ignoring a friend in need, then the action is still impermissible. But in this case, not doing it is an imperfect duty. Keep in mind, once again, the relationship between positives and negatives, that not ignoring a friend means helping them, but not stealing hot dogs doesn't translate to a positive, at least in any obvious way. Imperfect duties like helping friends admit of degrees. Beth has an obligation to embrace her friend's goals as if they were her own, but perhaps to a degree less valued than her own. Perfect duties, on the other hand, do not admit of degrees, again in keeping with the first formula. This consideration of perfect duties leads to a well-known objection to Kant's system. As standardly interpreted, the categorical imperative constitutes an absolutist claim about perfect duties. We saw that Alexandria's lying promise violates both formulas. Now notice that the violation in either case didn't seem to have much to do with the details of her situation. Any case of serious, willful deception could be argued to fail similarly under the Categorical Imperatives test. Now picture a German citizen, Hans, in the 40s, who is approached by Nazis looking for Jews. "We've heard that there are Jews hiding in this neighborhood," they say. "It's very important to us that we kill all the Jews. Do you know where some are?" Suppose Hans does know where some Jews are hiding, but like any sane, unbrainwashed person, he considers the Nazi extermination of Jews to be an egregious crime. Is it permissible for Hans to lie to the Nazis? The universalizability test seems to proceed just as it does in Alexandria's case. Hans's maxim might be, lie if it serves to protect innocent people from death or harm. If it were universalized, though, it would be understood that nobody makes truthful statements in such cases. Communication would break down so that lying would be meaningless, or at least it would be impossible to accomplish the deception. And so Hans couldn't consistently will it to be a universal law at the same time as wanting to accomplish the deception. The humanity formula seems to entail the same thing. If Hans lies to these Nazis, telling them that he heard a rumor that those Jews had left the area, he would be using the Nazis' humanity only as a means to an end, turning their own plans and machinations against them so that they're led on a wild goose chase. He would also seemingly be disregarding their rational agency and failing to embrace their goal of killing Jews. So the test result appears to be negative. Kant's system seems to imply that it's wrong to lie, even if it would be necessary to save innocent people from suffering or death. But the objection goes, this is absurd. It's clearly not wrong to lie in a case like this. How might Kant's moral theory be saved from this counterexample? Kantians could argue that we've applied the test wrong, or they could point out unaccounted for differences between Hans's case and Alexandria's that would change the result. However, it's difficult to see how that wouldn't open the door to different interpretations of the original cases too. Another possibility is to accept absolutism, holding on to the old saying, two wrongs don't make a right, but pointing out that at least Hans isn't required to tell the Nazis where the Jews are hiding. He can just remain silent. Or the absolutist might even allow that since Hans has to choose between two wrongs, it's better to choose the lesser of two evils and tell the lie. But one problem with the latter option is that lying to murderers about where to find their prospective victims doesn't seem like the lesser of two evils. It seems like a perfectly right thing to do. It could even be heroic. So it's difficult to see our way around this apparent counterexample to Kant's theory. A broader issue with Kant's ethics relates to its potential to produce novel and accurate conclusions on issues of practical ethical concern, or the lack thereof. This is one of many ways in which Kantian ethics seems to contrast starkly with utilitarianism. The utilitarians were not purely theorists, but social reformers. Their theory was concrete and straightforward, even if not completely simple in its application. And it has been mentioned in a previous video that the utilitarians were much ahead of their time on social issues, such as women's rights, prisoners' rights, and slavery. Having heard this, you might hope to find that most or all other historical philosophers also stood against what we can now say were backward and incorrect ideas of their day. Unfortunately, this is not usually so. They produced novel theories, of course, but concerning everyday practical issues we find obvious today, most of them went along with, endorsed, even perpetuated those cultural values from their day that have not stood the test of time, and Kant is no exception. Like virtually everyone back then, he was racist and sexist. He said and wrote horrible things about non-white people and women, and even produced a pseudoscientific theory of race, complete with superior and inferior groups. I'm sure you can imagine which ones were which. He also wrote about beating black slaves as if it was totally fine, claiming they were less sensitive to pain, although he did later condemn slavery in an apparent change of heart. It's been especially popular recently to call to attention and reevaluate the questionable mores of influential figures from history, and rightly so. By today's standards, Kant was not an especially moral person. The question has also been raised whether Kant, having made such morally outrageous statements, shows that his theory of morality was incorrect or useless. It probably doesn't. To begin with, it's a logical fallacy to argue against someone's statements and arguments by attacking their character. Take an obvious example. Suppose I argue scientist James Watson, who formulated an argument for the existence of DNA, was a terrible racist person, and therefore DNA is not real. Clearly, even if he was a truly terrible person, that has no bearing on whether his evidence of DNA was good. Now, Kant's case might seem different because it specifically concerns moral theory. You might expect that if a moral theory were correct, then believing that moral theory would improve a person's character. At least they wouldn't say such terrible things. But that isn't necessarily so. For one thing, even if you've discovered a complete and sound theory of morality, you might still not be willing to adhere to it yourself. And secondly, getting it right also depends on other beliefs that you have. Beliefs not about the nature of morality, but about morally relevant facts, often descriptive facts. It seems Kant had beliefs of this kind that were horribly wrong, about morally relevant differences between races and so on. However, since nothing in the theory itself entails any such morally relevant differences, the fault lies not with the theory, but elsewhere within Kant's beliefs. Consider the following analogy. Suppose we discovered some early utilitarians who had the very same moral theory as Bentham and Mill, entailing among other things that causing pain is the basis of all evil. But suppose also they had believed, or said they believed, that black people felt no pain, none whatsoever, and therefore they said, it's perfectly fine to treat them however you want. You can beat them, enslave them, anything. I'll just remind you, this is hypothetical. The actual utilitarians were anti-slavery and ahead of their time and so on. This would be shockingly stupid. It also seems like it would be a specifically moral failing. But it clearly wouldn't be a failure of the utilitarian theory. Their theory says pain is bad, causing pain is bad. They should have known that torturing black people was bad. So there are two possible ways of processing this. Either we would conclude they must have been pretending to believe that black people feel no pain, so that the immorality resides in their outwardly condoning what they secretly knew very well was horrible, or else we'd conclude that sometimes getting descriptive facts right is necessary for being moral, that being wrong about descriptive facts can be worthy of moral condemnation. And the latter conclusion seems unavoidable in any case. Any moral theory is going to require input from other kinds of facts. Now, what I've said about these hypothetical racist utilitarians applies to the unfortunate reality of Kant's actual racism. There's no reason why his theory wouldn't apply equally well to people of all colors and ethnicities. Nothing that the theory itself says about humans as rational agents worthy of respect, following the same moral code, applies less to non-whites than it does to whites, insofar as the theory does work at all, and I've raised some arguments that it does not. Now, this is not to deny that a moral theory could be proven wrong on the basis of its adherents' behavior. Surely it can. You could have a Nazi moral theory that explicitly includes doctrines of racial superiority, and I'm sure there probably were. The Nazi atrocities do repudiate those theories because belief in the theories themselves entailed those acts. But the argument that Kant's moral theory must have been wrong because he himself was racist is no good, because his racism simply did not stem from the theory. It was in fact in conflict with it, given an understanding of the morally relevant facts. Now, I've been emphasizing problems with the theory, and at this point, it might seem like the theories raise so many objections and counterexamples and weird loopholes that you may be wondering what's good about it or why it was and continues to be so influential. For the most part, the attractiveness of the theory is not so much what it actually succeeds in doing, but what it promises to do, and not just empty promises. The theory makes a Herculean attempt to tie together all the things we might want a moral theory to do. It calls forth this notion of a uniquely moral perspective that accounts for the inherent value in persons and their agency as equals under a moral law, tying this together with a rationality, which is supposed to explain why we should even care about doing the right thing. And on top of all that, it purports to provide a test that neatly apportions every possible choice into distinctive moral categories, each with their own internal logic and structure. And we haven't even covered the whole theory. This is just within the parts that we've been examining. The only problem is, it's wrong. Well, at least it's not completely right yet. It might just need to be tweaked or completed in some way. Well, have fun.